Okay, and we're live. And today I just wanted to start Surah 30, which is entitled The Romans. And this is one of the more notable surahs in the Quran because it contains an actual prediction of Mohammed, who was, as we know, a self declared prophet like Joseph Smith and Ellen G. White and other false prophets throughout history. Muhammad declared himself a prophet. He wasn't, as the Bible mandates, uh, his, someone whose prophethood was given to him by God, as all other prophets in previous ages were. But this surah contains an actual prediction, albeit a very vague and ambiguous and easily fungible prediction. So it's often invoked when Muslims want to point to something to demonstrate that Muhammad wasn't a false prophet, even though, as I'll explain, it really it really isn't evidence of any sort that Muhammad uh, prophesied when you actually examine it critically. But I'll begin with a little bit of a historical a little bit of historical background into and in the setting of this surah. At the time that Muhammad came about and he started to go around proselytizing and trying to gather people to him in the name of Islam, even though Islam itself wasn't a coherent ideology at the time, it wasn't called that. Uh, the Roman Empire was in a very parlous state. There were two very long-lasting dynasties called the Justinian dynasty and the Heraclean dynasty, and these were two very long-lasting dynasties that began with great promise and in some respects were the high watermark of the Roman Empire after the sack of Rome and and after the division of the empire but between the east and the west, and what we now know as the Byzantine Empire was established. And there's a great book written by Lars Brownworth, and I'll be reading from it shortly, an excerpt entitled Lost to the West. You can see it here. He's also he also has a podcast, which I believe, I'm not sure, I think it's called 12 Roman Emperors, which describes the Byzantine Empire. And this is a very short, approximately 300-page book that describes the entire, not the, well, it doesn't describe so much. It it goes over the history of the Byzantine Empire, which lasted for about a millennium. It was, but he's able to condense all of this history into about 300 pages, focusing on the major points, historical turning points, and the personalities of the Byzantine Empire, which really was a remarkable empire. It was, if we think of it this way, it was an extension of the Roman Empire. Back then, they weren't known as the Byzantine Empire; they were just known as Roman. So, what this surah is entitled "The Romans." These people were simply known as an extension of the Roman Empire after the sack of Rome. The uh, the the Western Roman Empire sort of receded, but even prior to that, when the capital was moved to what was known as Constantinople into the early 20th century, named after, of course, the Emperor Constantine, the man who decided to first make Christianity legal, and then eventually Christianity was turned into the official state religion. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics that go into the transition from Christianity from a despised, occasionally very harshly persecuted minority sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire, which I'm not going to get into this video, but suffice it to say, this marked a huge transition for Christianity as a global religion once it became officially legalized, and then became mandated as the official state religion of the Roman Empire. And there's some interesting details in the book in this book, Lost to the West, about the conflicts that arose between Christianity as the official church, and between the political ambitions and demands of the Roman Empire, the conflict between the Roman emperor and the Pope, who was recognized as the clerical authority, conflict between him and the civil authority of Rome, although there wasn't a separation between church and state as we know it today. But this book is interesting because it does describe the early growth of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula and how it challenged the Roman Empire. The empires, the dynasties I mentioned, the Justinian dynasty and the Heraclean dynasty, as I said, were marked by incredible growth, technological flourishing, and a renaissance of sorts after the sack of Rome and the division between the East and the West. The Justinian dynasty managed for a certain time to actually unite the two halves again. But of course, it ended in a tragedy from the point of view of the Romans, for several reasons. One of them, of course, being being the plague, and this is chronicled in a great book called Justinian's Flea, which another book I would recommend reading, which describes the effect the plague had on the on the empire at the time, and how it essentially reversed the gains that had been made up to that point. That, and also the conflict between Justinian and his best military advisor, his best general, Belisarius, who is considered one of the greatest Roman generals in history, up there with Scipio, with Caesar, with some of the other acclaimed Roman generals. He wasn't defeated so much by his opponents, and his victories were he was able to essentially snatch victory from the jaws of this defeat, particularly when retaking the Italian peninsula, retaking North Africa. He was a hugely successful general and esteemed very highly by his soldiers, but conflict with the emperor himself and his wife forced him to mitigated the success otherwise that he would have had. Plus, as I said, the plague that destroyed entire swaths of Roman and Western civilization at the time. So you have likewise, after that, you had the Heraclean dynasty, which for a brief period under Heraclius was resurgent, was repelling the enemies of the Roman Empire, and succeeding, having unparalleled successes. But that too ended in disappointment and failure, and it set the stage for the beginning of what would be known as the Caliphate and the Islamic Empire, conquests out of the Arabian Peninsula from a band of Arab nomads led by the successors to Mohammed. And these two dynasties bookmarked a very brief 10-year interregnum by the Emperor Phocas. He was a Thracian usurper of the throne. He killed the emperor and inherited his empire, and he's universally regarded as one of the worst Roman empires. There's some people who dispute that assertion, but for the most part, he's looked at as not only a usurper but a very maladapt administrator, and basically just someone who sandwiches these two bookends of long lasting dynasties that had immense victories and flourishing of the Roman Empire, but both of which eventually declined and set the stage for bad things, particularly the demise of the Heraclean dynasty, which set the stage for the Islamic invasion and Islamic colonialism seeping in and taking over North Africa, taking over the church, and basically setting itself up as the main antagonist for Western civilization, for Europe, for the next millennium, basically. And some people, there are different views on this. In this book, Lost to the West, the author pushes back to a certain extent on the negative assessments of Heraclius and tries to hello, love and light, Clayton. He pushes back on this idea that Heraclius, the weakness of that, his weakness set the stage for the Muslim invasion and the Muslim conquest, and points out that the victories that he amassed mitigated the damage that would have otherwise been inflicted. That Muhammad's successors and the Muslim Arab Empire would have posed much more of a threat to the heart of Europe, particularly Rome itself, much earlier, if it were not for Heraclius. And he also points out that in a concession to these critics, they are correct that if Rome had had a stronger emperor at the time, at the very end of the Heraclean dynasty, then they would have been able to fortify the distant possessions of this part of the Byzantine Empire, that they would have been able to withstand some of the early attacks by Muslim Arab armies, just because of it would have been better organized and just because of the strength in numbers. And as GW points out in the chat, the Persians and the Romans had been fighting each other endlessly. The advent of Islam the fact that they were able to establish an early beachhead in Asia in in uh, in order to launch attacks, that was they were able to do that in large measure because the Sasanian Empire, the Persians, were on their last legs. They were about to collapse at that very moment, and the Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire, was concerned with the Persians and had been for years, containing them, forcing for containing their ambitions, trying to, and Heraclian dynasty, of course, uh, sort of um, put them in terminal decline, and the Muslims, of course, finished off the Persian Empire because they were on they were about to go into the dustbin of history. But the Roman-Persian conflict so subsumed everything else that they weren't able to focus on this emerging threat from the desert, from Arabia. So they couldn't defend their possessions in the Levant and leading up to Constantinople. But as the author points out, the achievements of Heraclius did mitigate the damage, so that the Muslim Arab armies were able to take over North Africa, take over a large part of the Middle East, but didn't pose a threat to the heart of Europe for another century. Even so, they did underestimate the threat posed by Islam at this early stage. And there's a great introduction in chapter 12 of this book entitled "The House of War." Of course, Islam describes any non-Islamic, any parts of the world that haven't been subjugated by Islam as Dar al-Harb, the House of War, and it's legal from an Islamic perspective to wage war and attack these nations. And this is why you have terrorist attacks in Western nations, in Western Europe and in North America, and in other countries that haven't become fully submitted to Islamic law. And the chat points out Heraclius also officially replaced Latin with Greek as the language of administration in the Byzantine Empire. And this is an aside, but one of the, even as disastrous as the fall of Constantinople was, one of the things it did do was disperse all of these Greek speakers into Europe and help people there get an understanding of the original language of the New Testament. So the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, and you in the rest of Europe, you didn't have people who understood this language, so their understanding of scripture was very limited. So, but after the fall of Constantinople in the late 15th century, you had all of these Greek speakers who were able to interpret and translate the original text of the New Testament, of the Gospels. And this, of course, facilitated this happened at the same time that the Reformation was underway. So that one of the things that the fall of the Eastern Empire did, it actually did increase knowledge in the rest of Europe, particularly with regard to an understanding of the original text of the Bible, the original manuscripts, and the language it was written in, because these people did speak Greek, and Greek became the official official language of the Byzantine Empire. Excuse me. And Love and Light says, I like Greek better than Latin. I never actually studied ancient Greek. I did study Latin for 2 years, and I actually do like Latin. I thought it was a fun language to learn, to the extent that I did learn it. But it was gradually it was actually replaced in the Byzantine Empire, as mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this book. The title is entitled the chapter is entitled "The House of War," and there's an epigraph here: "With the sword I will wash my shame away." And this is by Abu Tamam, 9th century Arab poet, and this is a great description of the Muslim mentality. It's a very shame based. It's a very honor based culture, and there's Nabil Qureshi wrote a book where he and part of it he explains the difference between honor and shame based cultures, and also in his autobiography he describes an incident involving one of his friends who was a thief and wasn't regarded as a bad thing by his community until he was exposed and publicly exposed as a thief, and then he was shunned. And he goes on to explain how this dynamic in Islamic culture, which is focused so much on honor and preserving your honor, not so much because of an underlying system of ethics, so much as a fear that you'll be exposed and shamed. And this is why you have honor killings. Why honor killings are so prevalent in the Islamic world. But this is a great epigraph: with the sword I will wash my shame away. And this was the mentality of early Islamic warriors, and one of the reasons they attacked. They had so many. They had such an ambition to take over so much of the world. And I'll just read a little bit of this. The hot desert wastes of the Arabian Peninsula seemed neither particularly inviting nor threatening to the Byzantines, and there seemed no reason to suspect that they would. Populated by squabbling nomadic tribes, the region hardly seemed likely to pose a serious threat to anyone, much less the huge Byzantine state. In 622, however, the deserts were beginning to stir with a new energy as a man named Mohammed fled from Mecca to Medina and began hammering together the tribes of the interior. Infusing his followers with a burning zeal, Mohammed divided the world between Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Their duty was a holy jihad to expand the house of Islam at the point of a sword. Within 5 years, the Muslim armies were unleashed, and they exploded out of the desert with frightening speed. The timing of the invasion could hardly have been better. Hungry for conquest, the Arab armies arrived to find both great empires of the region exhausted and near collapse. The crippled Persians could put up little resistance. Their king, Yazdegerd III, appealed to both the Byzantines and the Chinese for help, but neither could offer any real assistance, and his fall was swift. Within a year, his tired armies were defeated, and he spent the next decade fleeing from one location to another until a local peasant killed him for his purse. Muhammad died in 632 of a fever, but nothing seemed able to slake his army's desire for land. Not even Persia pausing to digest the Persian Empire. By 633, they had crossed the deserted Byzantine frontier, and there they found a land ripe for the picking. Constantinople had never really been able to stamp out the Monophysite heresy, distracted as it was by the war with Persia. And when the Muslims arrived, they found the local populations eager to welcome them in. For the oppressed Monophysites, Islam, with its strict monotheism, was perfectly understandable, and the Arabs were at least Semites like themselves. Better to be ruled by their Arab cousins than the distant heretical emperors in Constantinople, especially since it was always easier to despise a heresy than a different faith. Putting up only token resistance, they watched as the Muslim army poured into Syria, sacked Damascus, and besieged Jerusalem. And this is a good point. Someone in the chat points out Zoroastrians used the death of Yazdegerd III in 651 as the base year for their calendar. This is a good point, and this is an interesting side note. The Monophysites. This is just this is something that people should consider when they think of Islam as one. Muslims think of it as a revelation from God because that's what they've been told to think. But in reality, it was an accretion of different um, of different teachings and religious ideas and concepts that gradually coagulated into one thing. So in this passage, he's describing the Monophysites, a heretical teaching within the early church, and people should remember that the early church, even though now there are all sorts of denominations and even heresies, people who purport to be Christian, who believe in some very bizarre doctrines. The early church was no different in terms of heretical thinking and schisms. And Paul even warns Timothy and the churches that he planted in Greece and elsewhere that there will arrive, that heresies will arrive. Hi, Paul, and that there be divisions. And this was true in the early church. There might not have been all these denominations, but there was all sorts of heretical thinking, things like Gnosticism. In fact, Paul says in one of his letters, he refers to science so called. So this is something that would have been known as gnosis. The Gnostics were a heresy that cropped up very early in the church among people who questioned the true divinity of Christ and questioned the triune nature of God. So you had Gnostics. You also had the Monophysites and other schisms and groups of people who would believe in heretical ideas, questioning the nature of God, whether God really did have a triune nature, whether there were truly three persons within the Godhead. Groups that thought that Christ was merely a man, that he didn't, that questioned the deity of Christ himself. And this was something that predominated very early in the church. And another issue was circumcision and keeping to the Mosaic law, and this is something that Paul addresses in letters, and particularly in the epistle to the Galatians, and also the epistle to the Hebrews. People who were being swayed by false teachers, particularly those it's referred to as those of the circumcision. In other words, what were known as Judaizers, people who wanted to keep new believers who were Gentiles, force them to observe Mosaic law, or force Jewish Christians, Jewish believers in Christ, to come back come back to traditional Judaism of the type that the Pharisees practiced. So this was a huge conflict that emerged in the early church, and many of Paul's letters address these specific issues. So I just want to bring that up because it mentions the Monophysite heresy, and this was also something that embroiled the early church. And and here I mentioned earlier that Heraclius, his even though the dynasty ended poorly, it could have been much worse. So the author describes that situation in this passage. But as poor as the empire's fortunes were at Heraclius' death, without him they would have been immeasurably worse. If he hadn't arrived to overthrow Phocas, the empire would have fallen easily prey to the Persians, and when the Islamic tide came rushing out of Arabia, there would have been nothing to shield Europe from the flood. Instead, by combining a touch of Justinian's mission with more than a hint of Belisarius's generalship, Heraclius had made Constantinople a bulwark against Islamic aggression, diverting the Muslim advance into the long wastes of North Africa and delaying its entrance into Europe. Now, of course, this is a matter of dispute because, of course, the early church, some of the central parts of the early church were located in, of course, it wasn't Rome so much as uh, Antioch and and um, and Alexandria and this little part of the empire. So there was a lot lost by the fact that the Muslims were able to sweep in unimpeded against large sections of the Byzantine Empire. But it is worth noting that he does have a point that the fact that Heraclius had bolstered the empire and rejuvenated it did prevent the Islamic armies from moving into the what we would consider the heart of Europe for for nearly a century, just like the Crusades. Even though they were a very delayed defensive measure, the Crusades did manage to give Europe a respite for close to 2 centuries, where Islam had been aggressing and conquering Europe, but the Crusades diverted their attentions and their energies and their military manpower into trying to recapture Jerusalem and Jerusalem and Israel, Lebanon for a long time, and allowed Europe itself to regroup from the onslaught of Islam. So even though the Crusades are thought of as a failure in the sense that they established these communities that were just wiped away within 2 centuries, but they did succeed in delaying the Islamic Empire and forcing them to focus on this area and not regroup and attack and drive even deeper into the heart of Europe. And George Washington says, I don't understand. What I don't understand is how Islam doesn't tolerate apostasy, yet the atheist Marir, uh, Al-Mari was never persecuted for his beliefs despite living in the 10th and 11th centuries. And this is true. There were a lot of what would be considered today heretical Islamic, particularly poets. Arabia has a history of wine poetry, and Ibn Rawak describes this in his book Why I Am Not a Muslim. All of these wine poets who would mock Islamic customs and piety, and some of them were persecuted, some of them were forced to flee, but others were venerated. And it is an interesting question. There are a lot of things that are interesting to look at, particularly in the early years of Islam, before this Islam as a dogmatic religious ideology had cohered. Muslims would like you to believe that Islam sprouted from the head of Allah and Mohammed, and this was just one continuous, unchanging system of belief, when in fact it really was, like I said, a coagulation of different ideas and that gradually evolved. For example, this idea of the eternality of the Quran was something that was considered heretical, and the people who espoused it were even persecuted by early caliphs because it made attributes of the Quran on par with Allah, and it conflicted with the concept of Tawheed, or becoming one. What Muslims would say is oneness. This idea of Allah being an absolutely Unitarian God. The eternality of the Quran conflicted with that because it considered attributes of the Quran as eternal, and therefore it set up something along with Allah. So people who espoused this were persecuted, but eventually the eternality of the Quran became a universally accepted idea in Islam, even though it conflicted with another Islamic idea, the idea of Tawheed, or becoming one, unification, oneness. Read the Quran, so hard to read, so many contradictions. It's true. And to go back to a point that was mentioned earlier in the chat, just to continue this point about Heraclius, I'll just read briefly from this. His early years had seen one glorious victory after another, and he had died after the overthrow of Khosrow II. With the Persian Empire defeated and the true cross restored to Jerusalem, his subjects would have remembered him as one of the greatest emperors to sit on the Byzantine throne. This is something to keep in mind. His reign saw the great turning point for much of the Middle East. For 1,000 years, these lands had been Hellenized, ruled by Roman Empire, at first pagan and then Christian. They had contributed much to classical civilization, providing some of the finest emperors, theologians, saints, and poets of the classical world. And this is something else to consider. For example, Augustine of Hippo, he is one of the thinkers that contributed a great deal to the soteriology, to the thinking on soteriology and eschatology, and just theology in general of the church, both and Protestants and Roman Catholics and everyone in the Christian church, regardless of the denomination, esteems Augustine, rightly so. And you can read his words and see how he contributed to the thinking of the church in books like The City of God, which refutes the idea that pagans, that Christianity is responsible for Rome being sacked. He goes into this in detail, refuting this canard that Christians were somehow responsible for this. And in fact, you could argue this is an aside, but you could argue that the Roman Empire at that time was very far from being really a Christian empire, even though it had adopted Christianity as the official religion. The actual beliefs and practices, particularly of the Roman emperors, were very far from Christianity. In fact, in this book, Lost to the West, the forgotten Byzantine Empire that rescued Western civilization, he describes the early beliefs of the Roman empires. Most of the very first ones were either Arian or quasi-Arian in their beliefs. They also believed in baptismal regeneration. which is why you see a lot of Roman emperors on their deathbed. This was after the advent of Christianity being made the official religion. They believed that in baptismal regeneration. So a lot of the Roman emperors would only be baptized on their deathbed. So Augustine tackles that misconception. And also, just another aside, one of the Stylicus, one of the great generals who was given this impossible task of maintaining control of Roman territory as as the invasions swept in from Gaul and other and the Huns. excuse me. Stylicus, the general, he was persecuted by the Roman Senate, which still retained, even though pagan Roman beliefs had by that point declined greatly among the populace. The Roman senators still held to these beliefs, and they attacked him for his seeming military defeats and got rid of him. He was executed, and the Roman Empire, the western half of the Roman Empire, fell shortly thereafter. But this was also a gradual process, a very gradual process. As I said, the seat of power had already been moved by that point to Constantinople, the new city of Byzantium, and this was a very long process. But as I said, Augustine was one of the most important theologians and thinkers in the early church. So this description is very accurate. How the Eastern Empire contributed so much to so much to Christianity and so much to civilization, and continue to over the next millennium. So just to wrap up this, since it's getting a bit long, I'm just going to begin reading from the Romans and really delve into this surah in the next video. But I'll start by reading the first verse, the first couple of verses. In the Alaf Lam Mim, the Romans are vanquished in a near land, and they, after being vanquished, shall overcome. Now, this is used by Muslims in order to describe, to say that Muhammad really was a true prophet. And someone in the chat says the Muslim conquest had a racial aspect as well as religious one, and it's true. Islam is a very fundamentally racist religion. You have to be Arab to be a Muslim. It's impossible. And we know this goes against scripture, because God is not a respecter of persons. He's not a racist. He's not a racist God. He can speak in any language, and anything from Korean to Arabic to English to even sign language. There's a deaf ministry called Roman Roads for the Deaf, which reaches out to people who have no hearing and people who are illiterate. And God can communicate to anyone, regardless of what language they speak, or even if they don't speak, even if they're mute. So the Islamic idea of God or Allah, who they understand to be God, is very limited because in order to become a Muslim, you have to become also an Arab, which is why you have people reciting long passages from the Quran in a language in which they don't understand. And of course, Arab Muslims had more rights than non-Arab Muslims, non-Arabs who converted to Islam. But just to go back to this point, in a near land, and they, after being vanquished, shall overcome. Within a few years, Allah is the command before and after, and on that day the believers shall rejoice. With the help of Allah, He helps them. He helps whom He pleases, and He is the mighty, the merciful. This is Allah's promise. Allah will not fail His promise, but most people do not know. They know the outward of the world's life, but the hereafter. But of the hereafter, they are absolutely heedless. And so this is what Muslims hang their hat on: the fact that it says, "In a near land, and they, after being vanquished, shall overcome." And this is what happened. The initial forays into the Roman desert were not really that important. They were these little skirmishes, but eventually they would defeat the Romans, quote unquote, at the Battle of Yarmouk, and this was the turning point which shifted power in favor of the Muslims, and a distracted, very preoccupied Roman Empire, which was preoccupied with conflict, of course, with the dying Persian Empire, but also, more importantly, at this point, also conflict, also the division itself within the Roman Empire between the East and the West, and all sorts of other conflict with Slavs and Avars from the Balkans coming down and attacking. So they did not have enough focus to direct towards this very, very seemingly minuscule band of nomadic warriors making war on them, but that was ultimately the downfall of ultimately the Byzantine Empire. Even though it took another 700 to 800 years, and that was ultimately the downfall of the empire, that they did not have the focus on thwarting this threat, and they did lose huge chunks of land in Asia, the Near East, and North Africa, just because they weren't focused. So this description, they, after being vanquished, shall overcome. They succeeded, and then they fell back. And of course, this is used by Muslims as an indication that Muhammad was a prophet. But Muhammad really wasn't a prophet, Inky, when you think about it, because this is a vague description of what will happen. The Roman Empire will win, then fall back. Then it doesn't really make any sense when you look at it. If this is a prediction, it's not a very, very powerful prediction. In the Bible, when someone prophesies, or when God foretells what's going to happen, He says Cyrus will come into power in Persia and be the liberator of Israel after it's been in captivity for more than 7 decades, and they'll return from Persia to Israel, more than 50,000, and then rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls. And this is described in the books of Ezra and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's an actual prophecy, because this was foretold centuries before, specifically what would happen. Or when Jesus says the temple, when Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and his own resurrection, these are actual prophecies saying the Romans will lose, then win, then this is not a prophecy. The Roman Empire had already been through many defeats and victories, and resurgences, and as I said, the Justinian and the Heraclean dynasties, that was the story of these two dynasties. Immense victories, even Justinian reunifying the two halves very um uh but eventually gradually decline, and then in the case of the Justinian Empire, disaster once the plague, pestis, once that hit. Of course, it erased all of the victories that Justinian and his general Belisarius had accomplished. So this is not, when you compare this to the prophecies of the Bible, it really doesn't hold up. So if this is the only prophecy, it doesn't really understand, and we have to consider the fact that this prophecy might have been written long after the descriptions, the vague descriptions alluded to, the events alluded to in this passage. So it might not even be a prophecy. It might be something that actually happened, and that Mohammed or the authors of this book are simply describing. Yeah, I thought that Rome had simply fell, and the Surah was simply explaining that didactically. Yeah, the Western Roman Empire Rome had already been sacked over a century and maybe like 70 years. I'm trying to work out the timeline, but Rome fell. Rome was basically sacked in the 5th century, and then Muhammad in the 6th century, rather, and then Muhammad in the 7th century came about. So this might be a description of the fall of the Western Empire, but it could also be a description of the setbacks that the Byzantines had in facing the Muslims. But we have to consider the fact that Muhammad predicted that Rome would fall. Rome in the sense of the Roman Empire, but also the seat of Rome, which would be the Rome in Italy now, where the Vatican is. And that's never happened, even though Muslim raids did attack Rome. Rome has never succumbed. So in that sense, Muhammad's predictions were false. He was a false prophet, because Rome is still standing. The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, where most people, when they think of Rome, they think of the Vatican or the seat of the Roman Catholic Church. That's still there, and Italy itself is not, even though it's being attacked through Hijra, through this great migration. You could say that's undermining, but it was never conquered in any sort of military tactical battle. The German Holy Roman Empire supplanted the old Roman Empire from Italy. This is another good point. The Holy Roman Empire, which there's an old adage about, or joke about that, saying the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but that was seen as the temporal successor, and would ultimately. There's another interesting story in their conflict with the Roman Catholic Church. Eventually, even though their power was vested in the power of the Pope. This is another story to go into, but I just wanted to read that brief passage to illustrate that Muhammad was not a true prophet. He was a false prophet, and this vague description of setbacks, whether it refers to the fall of the sack of Rome, which had happened over a century earlier, or it refers to the vicissitudes of the conflict between Islam and the Byzantine Empire. In either case, it's not a real prophecy. The Byzantines refer to themselves as Romans, and Constantinople as a new Rome. So Muslims could say the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was what the Quran was referring to. Voltaire, yeah. That's a good point. They could say that Constantinople, but that was not what. Of course, you have to go back to that time period and understand what was thought of as Roman. Now, what we know as the Byzantine Empire, which wasn't known as the Byzantine Empire at the time, that, of course, these people thought of themselves as Romans. They still thought they were the legitimate heirs to the Roman Empire. And to a large degree, they were correct in the sense that the culture, the religion, the art, and everything had its seat in Constantinople. And very shortly after the capital was moved to the east, the 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 empire there became the the cultural and political capital of Rome, of the quote unquote Roman Empire, even though the western half of the Roman Empire still existed. And as I described earlier, Justinian in particular tried to unite and unify or reunify these two these two um, these two empires, these two which had grown increasingly separate, and this ultimately led to the downfall of the Byzantine Empire, because there's the Crusades are also described in detail in this book, and the conflict trying to um, trying to marshal support within both halves in order to but the eastern and the western part of the church trying to unify these two entities in unity against Islam to retake Jerusalem, to retake the Holy Land. This was a huge conflict, and of course, during the Fourth Crusade, it resulted in uh, huge massacres by the Crusaders within the eastern half, and the eventual sack of the capital, Constantinople, and the brief replacement of them with a Crusader state. And this left indelible marks on the Byzantines and led to resentment and distrust of the Western church, which it should be noted, the Pope at the time, and there were forces that were very cognizant of this fact, that this would destroy their connection to the East, which had been gradually attenuating. The Great Schism, of course, happened in the 11th century, but this was something that had been developing for a very long time. But again, that's another story. I just wanted to start this surah and address the underlying historical conditions that gave rise to this, give it some background and context. And in the next video, I'll be going more deeply into the surah itself, which is relatively brief. It's only about 4 pages. I've already gone over the first passage, which is from which the title comes. But I'll be going into more detail the rest of the surah. Thanks for everyone that joined me. Like I said in other videos, if you like this video, feel free to share it, particularly with your Muslim friends. This video was more historical in background rather than an exegesis of this specific surah. But maybe it was written during the era of Umar, after Byzantine was overrun by Arabs. That's another possibility. Again, the Quran is not really this cohesive document, and there are a lot of discrepancies that Muslims don't like to address. I like history too. My father was a history major, and it's a very interesting subject. And I will see all of you later.